When God gave Israel and the world the 10 commandments, the people were standing far off, terrified, because they saw thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountains smoking. They told Moses, "You speak to God for us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." His greatness, his holiness, his might, his power, his presence was too much for them. So they asked Moses to be their mediator, which of course was the call that God had placed on his life. So Moses went back up Mount Sinai to hear what God had to say. Moses was on Mount Sinai for at least 40 days, but probably much longer than that, as God gave him laws about Israelite life, directions for the tabernacle, directions for the Ark of the Covenant, and much more to show them how to live in fellowship with him. And all this time, the people were waiting at the base of the mountain, probably getting bored. The old saying, "An idle mind is the devil's workshop," certainly applies to them, because what follows is the famous golden calf episode from the history of Israel.
Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play.
This is one of the most famous and sinful episodes from the history of Israel. But I think we often misunderstand what their sin really is here. We read this and assume that they are rejecting the true God, Yahweh, and setting up their own false god for themselves, something like Baal or some other idol. Yet when we look a little more closely, we see that's not what they're doing. They ask Aaron to make them gods. But in the Hebrew manuscripts that exist for this text, some say gods, and some say make us a god. That starts us wondering if they're really asking for pagan gods, like we might first think. Then, when Aaron fashions the calf, they say that the calf is the God who brought them out of Egypt. That's Yahweh. They don't seem to be thinking that he's making an idol to some other god. Then what do? In verse 5, they hold a feast to Yahweh, the name God gave Moses for himself. By the way, in our modern translations, whenever you see Lord in all caps, that's the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh. When we put all that together, we see that what they are doing is making a representation of Yahweh, a graven image. They don't think that they are turning their back on God. They don't think that they are rejecting Yahweh. They are making a calf as their way of worshiping him and relating to him. Now, as I said last week, we don't break any of the other 9 commandments without first breaking commandment number 1. But what the Israelites are doing here isn't as simple as just following a false god. They think they are following the true God, but they are doing it falsely. They are breaking the first commandment, yes, but they are also breaking the second commandment.
You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Now, to understand the second commandment, to understand what Israel is doing with the golden calf, and to understand even how we break the second commandment, we need to understand what pagans were actually doing when they carved their idols and worshiped them. We tend to think of the pagans in the Bible as simpletons who didn't really understand that a rock or a wooden image of some god wasn't alive. We look at them and think, how ridiculous that they would think that statue is their god. But pagans knew their images weren't identical to the actual gods themselves. Anyone who worshipped the sun god or the god of fertility knew that their little statue wasn't the god himself. They knew their gods dwelled in the heavens. That's why, for example, in Acts 14:11, when Paul performed miracles, they said, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Pagans viewed their carved images as representations of their gods and conduits to channel and use the power of that god safely. Think of them kind of like how we get electricity through power lines, cords, and outlets. We know that the power cord, the outlet, or even the electrical lines running to our house is not the source of the power. The source of the power is far away at the Appalachian power plant. But without those cords and plugs, we can't get the power safely. If the power plant just zapped its power to us in the form of bolts of electricity, they would fry our house, and us too. So we must have physical lines, cords, and outlets so the power can flow to us safely and we can control it however we please. Pagans thought of their carved images kind of like that. The image represented the god, but it was not the god himself. It was an attempt to represent the god in a way that they could understand him or her. The image gave the worshiper a measure of control over the power of the god. The raw power of the god would destroy them, much like trying to zap electricity to our homes without power lines. But if they had the image and they did the right rituals, they could collect, channel, and control the power of the god however they wanted to, kind of like we do when we use an outlet. Finally, without the image, the worshiper was completely cut off from the power and the blessings of the god. Just like without power lines and outlets, we are completely cut off from the source, the power plant. For the pagan, the carved image helped them to understand their god, control the god's power, and have access to the blessings of that god, because they didn't really trust the god just to give them blessings on its own. Now, knowing that, think about what Israel was doing, making the golden calf. They were tired of God being thick darkness and unable to be understood by them. They were tired of not being in control. They were tired of waiting for God to act. So they thought they could make an image, do the feasts and sacrifices, and God would respond as they wanted him to. You see, they wanted to worship a God they could fully understand, control at least in some way, and have his blessings at their bidding. Yet that is exactly what God is saying he is not through the second commandment. Remember, our first question for studying the commandments is, what does this command tell us about God? The second commandment tells us that God cannot be controlled by us or worshiped in any way except how he has told us to worship him. Think about those three things the pagans thought their images did, and you'll see how they all misunderstand the true God. Thinking we can make an image of God misunderstands his majesty. God is so far above anything in all of creation that any image, no matter how grand or complex we make it, lowers God from the level of infinite and beyond our ability to understand fully to something limited and understandable by our small minds. It would be like me trying to say that a stick figure drawing accurately represents the personality and beauty of my wife. She would be rightly insulted by that. And God is insulted when we try to represent him by any image. Any image lowers the majesty of God. Now, of course, that does not mean that we can't know God. We can, for he reveals himself to us through the Bible and through Jesus Christ. But even if we could know all the Bible has to tell us and teach us, we wouldn't have God all figured out or find an image that doesn't insult his majesty. Thinking we can make an image of God misunderstands his sovereign freedom. You see, when we make an image of God, like the pagans, we're attempting to make him something we can control in some way. Perhaps we don't make a physical image, but we can make an image in our minds that simplifies him and makes us think, I understand God, therefore I can predict what he will do or manipulate him. That's what the Israelites were trying to do with the calf, make something they could understand and control. So whether we're making a golden calf or a graven image in our minds, we're essentially trying to tame God for our own use. But as Mr. Beaver says, he's wild, not like a tame lion. Of course, that does not mean that God is unreliable. He's perfectly reliable, and we can trust him to work for our good and always keep his promises. Yet we can't tame him or control him or manipulate him. And if we think we can, we've created a graven image. Thinking we can make an image of God misunderstands his great love for us. Pagans made images because they couldn't trust their gods to care about them. They thought that a god that held all the cards would never bother to help them. Yet that's not the kind of God we serve. We don't need to manipulate him to treat us properly. He does that because he loves us and has made us his children through Jesus Christ. We don't need to have some kind of bargaining chips with him to make sure we get what we need or force him to fulfill his good promises. We may not be able to understand him fully or control him, but that doesn't mean we can't trust him. We can. He loved us so much that he sent Jesus as the fulfillment of all he had been promising his people since way back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:15. Yes, he is sovereign, and yes, he does hold all the cards. But he is also the God who loves us with a never-stopping, never-giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. He proved that in Jesus. So, if I were to sum up what this command shows us about God in a single word, it would be transcendence. Now, kids out there, I know that's a big word, but it simply reminds us that God is so far beyond our understanding, our control, or our mistrust, that any graven image is just an insult to him. So that leads us to what God's will for us is in this commandment. And here, as with the last time, the Children's Catechism question is very helpful. What does the second commandment teach you? To worship God only as he commands, and not to worship God by using statues or pictures. As with the last couple of lessons, memorize this, adults and kids. I pray that it will be a short answer that reminds you of all we talk about today. Like we said last time, it can be like the smell that brings back a flood of memories. The answer is short, but it gets to the heart of the matter. You see, the first commandment was about not worshiping false gods. This commandment is about not worshiping the true God falsely. The first command is about not worshiping idols. This one is about not trying to make the true God into an idol small enough for us to understand fully and control. That's what the Israelites were trying to do, trying to make the infinite Yahweh into a smaller, tamer idol that they wished he was. Yet that kind of small God is not worth worshiping at all. In fact, that's where the gift of this commandment can be found. That's the third question we need to ask. What gift, what good is held out to us in this commandment? It is the gift of serving and worshiping the true, majestic, sovereign, gracious, trustworthy God who is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in one being. Only he is deserving of our worship, and only he is really good for us to worship. We all worship something. We talked about a lot of those idols last time. Yet when we put our trust in those other things, what happens? They fail us. They aren't worthy of our trust. And when we make a false image of God in our hearts, our minds, or physically like the Israelites did, that graven image isn't worthy of worship and will let us down. Think of it like someone demanding you take the well-made, reliable, sturdy bridge over a raging river when you want to take the rotting, falling apart one. That person isn't being cruel to tell you not to trust the rotting bridge. They are keeping you from stepping out onto something that will collapse underneath you. That is good. If we make a graven image of God that we think we can fully understand, control, or manipulate, we're stepping out onto a rotting bridge. It is difficult to understand a God who is completely in control of all that happens and plans and uses all things for our good, even the evil that happens to us. We don't know how that works. It confuses us. But if we replace that true God with an image in our mind who isn't in complete control and say things like, yes, it is tragic that you lost your child, but just know that wasn't God's plan. We're stepping out onto a rotting bridge. The God who doesn't include the bad things as part of his plan may be understandable and controllable by us, but he is a tame, toothless lion who can't really help us when our life is falling apart, the country is in great turmoil, or a virus threatens all that we hold dear. A God who didn't have all that in his plan can't help us with it now. And that God is like a rotting bridge. It is good for God to say, don't dumb me down like that. Don't make a false image of me. Don't worship some false God. If you don't fully understand me and can't control me, that's fine. You can trust me because I gave you Jesus. When we worship him as he is commanded and don't try to simplify him, then we won't be able to tame him, yes, but we can count on him when things are good and when the bottom falls out. That is a gift. So let's end by thinking about how we fall short of this command and how the gospel helps us to obey. It's tempting for us to think that since we don't make physical carved images much these days, that we can just move past this one. But we are just as prone to break this command as the first one. When we think that our church attendance, devotions, prayer, or obedience will compel our Heavenly Father to love us more, like the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son, we've made a graven image. We've simplified God into something like Santa Claus that we can manipulate if we're just good for goodness sake. Yet what does the gospel tell us about that? It tells us that God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God sent Jesus because he loved us before we could ever do anything to deserve it. That's why Paul says later on in Romans 8:32, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? When we think we can use pictures or images to focus or aid us in worship, we're breaking this commandment. That's why we don't ever have any images, statues, or symbols in worship except for the Lord's Supper and baptism that Jesus specifically gave to us. Now, I'm not trying to say that you can't have a nativity scene or something like that at home, but any image or object that you think focuses your prayer, that you sing to, you kiss, or you give any spiritual meaning to whatsoever, is a graven image. If you're unsure about it, just ask yourself, if this got burned up in a fire, would I feel like my spiritual life would suffer? If the answer is yes, it has become a graven image. When we overemphasize one perfection or attribute of God so much that it drowns out the others, we're making a graven image in our minds. For example, it's popular today for people to quote from 1 John 4:8 and say, God is love, so he'd never send a well-meaning Muslim or Hindu to hell just because they don't know Jesus. Yet that's emphasizing God's love so much that it drowns out his holiness and his justice against sin. It's ignoring that Jesus himself said that if we don't know him, we do not know the Father. And it's trying to simplify God and his work in the world into something that doesn't confuse us. It is hard to understand the balance of God's love and his justice, but we don't have to understand it. We simply have to look to the cross, where both are balanced perfectly: God's wrath against our sin and his love for us in Jesus. We can trust that God to get the balance right. Or it's difficult to understand how God can be sovereign and good while evil and suffering still exist. But the solution is not to emphasize God's goodness and reduce his sovereignty so that he's not in complete control of all that happens. That kind of God is a tame, toothless lion, not worth worshiping. The solution is to look to Jesus, who entered into this sinful world, suffered, and then defeated sin, death, and the devil on the cross and rose again in victory. You can trust a God who is not only sovereign, but who bled for you. When times are very difficult, sacrificing God's sovereignty over it just so we can understand him is stepping out on a rotting bridge. You don't want a God like that. The only secure ground on which to stand is the ground beneath the cross. When we start making up our own ways to worship God, we're making a graven image in our minds. That is why the catechisms all say something like, the second commandment forbids the worshiping of God by images or any other way not appointed in his word. To make up our own ways of worshiping God just because I feel worshipful doing them is to make up a false God. To illustrate, let's bring back John and Jane. Most of you out there have probably heard of love languages. They are the way a person receives love from others. So let's say Jane's love language is quality time. So when John spends time with her, listening and talking, she feels loved. But suppose John thinks, well, I feel more loving when I give her gifts, so I'm going to do that instead. What is he trying to do? He's trying to love a woman that does not exist. He's loving a woman who looks like Jane, but has the love language he wants her to have, receiving gifts, and not the love language she really has. He's created a false Jane in his mind. Well, we show love to God by worshiping him, and it is he who gets to tell us how he will receive it. We don't get to make it up ourselves like John. Just because we feel worshipful doing something doesn't mean that's how he receives it. If we think he should receive it just because we feel it, we are trying to worship a graven image in our minds, a God who doesn't exist. So, in public Sunday worship, that means reading his word, preaching his word, singing, praying, and the sacraments. We don't get to add other things just because we want to. If we do and think, well, God should just accept my worship like this, we're trying to worship a God who doesn't exist. In our life, Paul tells us that living a life acceptable to God is our spiritual worship. How do we know what is acceptable? Well, for starters, the 10 Commandments. If we want to live a life that is worshipful to God, we strive to follow those and all they teach us. If we say, well, I feel like this is good for me, or I think God wants me to do this, when it goes against his commandments, or if we say, God doesn't really care if I follow this one, we're trying to serve a God who doesn't exist, a graven image. Now, with all that, we might get nervous and think, I don't know if I'm breaking this one. Jesus takes care of that too. He never broke this command and obeyed it perfectly for us. So when we fail and step out on a rotten bridge that collapses underneath us, we fall into his arms. And Jesus is also the fulfillment of this command himself. He is the image of the invisible God. And whoever has seen me has seen the Father, he said. So to see God rightly and not a graven image, we simply need to look to Jesus in all his majesty, sovereignty, and trustworthiness. And you know, when we do that, we'll never be satisfied with our small, graven images anyway. You think about that. Amen.